Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live stream for Scaling and Prevailing. I'm Chris Yeh, and I'm delighted that you guys can join me tonight for this broadcast. This is a part of the Stanford D.School's class on scaling up solutions, and we are delighted to have an incredible lineup of people with us tonight. So, with joining me as part of the broadcast, there is myself, Chris Yeh. I am the co-author of Blitzscaling. Hold on. Let me just turn off my broadcast. I was watching myself over here. I apologize. So I'm delighted to be joined today by my fellow colleagues and instructors. My friend Bob Sutton, professor at Stanford University, my colleagues Laura McBride and also Mark Chun, and we are delighted to have everyone here with us today. So what we're going to do today is we are going to go ahead and have, for the next 2 hours, a set of discussions and presentations around the concept of scaling up responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're very glad to have a series of wonderful guests with us today. We're going to get a chance to have conversations and give presentations. And at the end of those conversations and presentations, you'll have your chance to ask your questions. And you'll be able to do that on Twitter using the hashtag Scaling and Prevailing. So before we begin, let me go ahead and get my fellow instructors to introduce themselves. Bob, are you able to join the stream and say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Sutton. I'm Chris's colleague and also author of a book, Scaling Up Excellence, and I'm delighted that you all can join us.
Fantastic. Laura, are you able to come on?
Hello. Nice to see everyone, and exciting to have you all here. And I'll be monitoring the Twitter chat tonight, so feel free to tweet to Scaling and Prevailing, and I'll be taking your questions and submitting them back to our panel. Glad to have you.
And Mark, if you can put in an appearance. Mark, we especially have to thank as the person who has brought together all this technology infrastructure that makes this possible.
Hi, Mark. I am social distancing because Laura is now exactly 6 feet away. So I'm going to tuck away.
I'm very curious how you decide who gets to wear the mask and who gets to show their face.
It's both and.
Well, yes, and, because after all, this is the D-School. So thank you so much thank you everyone for coming on. Here's what we're going to do for this evening. So we're going to stick very closely to our schedule. We're going to spend the next few minutes just going ahead and laying out what you're going to do. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have our three speakers. So at 6:15, Bob Sutton is going to introduce our first speaker, Stephanie, who is going to tell you about some of the amazing things that have been done in response to the COVID-19 pandemic over at the U.S. Digital Response Team. After Bob has had a chance to interview Steph, we're going to go into a Q&A session. So as Bob and Steph are speaking, you can go ahead and tweet your questions using the hashtag Scaling and Prevailing. We'll pick out those questions from the Twitter stream, and we'll go ahead and get as many of them answered as possible. At 6:40 p.m., Laura's going to come back on and talk a little bit about the work that the D-School is doing, both during this pandemic and in general. And we'll talk a little bit about the class that's actually going to be happening tomorrow. This live stream is just one piece of a bigger picture where we're going to be talking about the ways that you scale up responses, whether it's in healthcare, education, or technology. After that, we're going to move on to our second speaker, Enrico, who is coming to us from Roblox, a company that many of you are probably familiar with, especially if you have young children. He'll be talking about how you deal with scaling in the video game industry and the very different approaches to scaling that different companies take. And finally, how they're managing to deal with the extreme increase in demand that has come with the COVID-19 pandemic. Any of you who have children at home know that video game usage has skyrocketed. And fortunately, our video game companies have been up to the task and have been able to keep things up and running. Finally, after the Q&A session, you'll get a chance to ask questions of Enrico. Again, tweet those questions to hashtag Scaling and Prevailing. We'll introduce our final speaker of the evening, Othman Laraki, who is the co-founder and CEO of Color Genomics. And I'll be interviewing him in a fireside chat. We'll be learning about the origins of the company and just the process they went through to pivot from what they normally do, which is provide genetic testing to consumers that help them understand underlying health conditions like cancer and heart disease, to being able to be one of the biggest providers of COVID-19 testing in the Bay Area. After the Q&A session with Othman, we'll go ahead and come back for some closing remarks, talk about what we've learned, look at any interesting comments from the chat room, and hopefully send you on your way, having learned something from these three wonderful speakers and from the stories that they have to share. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Bob on. Hey, Bob, how are you doing?
Hi, Chris. I'm great.
So I noticed that we actually have a little bit of time before we definitely need to start. Technically, we don't have to start until 6:15, but I'm thinking we've got such great content. Why don't we give people
Let's go.
more of it?
Is Steph ready? Steph, you ready? Bring her on.
Ready. I'm here.
Hi. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi. Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So let me start out and introduce Steph Hannon. I know Steph very well. So a little bit about Steph. So she's got an undergraduate degree in computer science, right? Isn't that what your undergraduate degree is in from Stanford? So when I first met her, she's got an MBA from Harvard Business School. I first got to know Steph in a nearly year-long class now called the Mayfield Fellows Program. And she told me to say that I was her favorite Stanford student ever. So I'm just following instructions. Yes.
Yes. For this video to be recorded forever.
For record. You're really in my top 5, but I'm not going to tell you that.
Okay.
And Steph went on to do all sorts of stuff. She spent about 6 years at Cisco doing serious computer science, then about a decade at Google in all sorts of roles, everything from Google Maps to some of the stuff in google.org as well. Then she had sort of an amazing role, which we're not going to talk about very much tonight, which was that she was CTO of Hillary Clinton's campaign, I think the first CTO of a major presidential campaign. She moved to Brooklyn and scaled up that operation.
I want to say first female CTO. There were a lot before me.
Oh, I'm sorry, female CTO. I apologize. And then she went off and did some other stuff. But what we're really going to be talking about tonight are kind of the two roles that she's involved now. The first one, which is the main one, is that she's involved in this kind of amazing 7-week-old organization called U.S. Digital Response. And while she's doing that, at the same time, she's moved to Sacramento to help with a whole bunch of technological challenges that the state, our state government has. So Steph is somebody who knows scaling. So I think that's enough of an introduction, Steph. Steph, let's start out and let's talk about this U.S. Digital Response, the 7-week-old organization. Why don't you just start out and tell us kind of what the mission is and kind of where you're at right now?
Well, I'm so happy to be here, Bob. So happy to have a reason to engage in this dialogue with you and to share kind of lessons and this amazing organization. I could not be more proud to be a part of it, and it blows my mind that we're only 7 weeks old. So USDR is USDR, I almost said it wrong, Bob, is an organization that brings technology volunteers together with governments to solve problems around COVID and help people get the services they need. So the concept came from some ex-Obama CTOs, and our CEO is an amazing woman named Raylene, who's of Stripe and Facebook DNA. And really it just started with somebody putting up a form. Somebody said, you know what, governments are going to be overwhelmed. A lot of government services are antiquated. They're going to have unprecedented scale demands like had never been seen. And we want to build sort of an army or workforce of volunteers that can be a SWAT team of what we call rapid response. We put up the form, and I think we had 500 the first day. I think we had 2,000 by week 2. We had 4,000 by week 4, and we just crossed, or we're over 5,000 volunteers now. And so you can think about the organizational challenges of sort of how do you manage that? How do you intake projects? How do you interview volunteers? How do you match people to the right skill set? So you're trying to execute a bunch of projects while you're trying to build an organization.
Well, so why don't you tell us a little bit about, so who are the people who have done this? Are they people who have worked together before? Did you know the folks? Like, how does a group come together this quickly? Because my friend Chris Yeh, who writes about blitzscaling, and this is blitzscaling, baby. I mean, you are doing it.
And also we're doing it with never ever having a single meeting in person, which is a whole nother challenge. So I think it does come from a lot of personal connections. As I mentioned, the founders were Code for America, Obama CTO, and USDS. US Digital Service is an army of engineers embedded in federal government. Raylene came from Stripe and Facebook. I come from Google, Facebook, and the Hillary campaign. There were a lot of Dropbox people. There were a lot of Google people. So in the early days, it was really bringing in people we knew and trusted, especially at the core team or organization level. And in fact, when we were structuring our Airtable for the intake of volunteers, we specifically made a column that's like, yeah, I know this person, like I trust this person, because then we could skip over the interview process. So yeah, I think relationships and knowing people made it possible to kind of coalesce faster.
So that's really interesting. My friends who study successful startups will say that having prior joint experience, having worked together in other places, is really key. And I guess you're the example. You could launch a digital organization because you had enough trust to know each other. That's just fantastic.
Yeah, but it is funny because you do see little gems of like, this is a Stripe thing, this is a Facebook thing, this is a Google thing. Like we know each other, but we haven't all worked together. So that's been kind of interesting.
So you got to talk across boundaries. So,
exactly.
So why don't you give it some examples of some of the different projects you're working on, and then maybe we can dig into at least one of them.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I just wanted to tell you, because I know you love this organization, I just really wanted to say that in the space of like 5 weeks, we went from everyone in all meetings, to having a core team with daily stand-ups, including the weekend. And then the core team got too big. So then we had sub-teams, and there was a volunteer team, a projects team, a government team, a tools team. And then each of those developed their own practices. And then we put leads in each of those teams. And then the core team got more structure. And then we decided we had to take strategy decisions out of the core team because that was tactical. So then we went, core team meetings, strategy meetings. And then we decided there wasn't enough collaboration across projects. So we made a show and tell. So now we have a show and tell. And then we were like, well, we have to know each other socially and personally. So then we added a happy hour. So just in the course of 4 weeks, we went through, I think, organizational iterations that would take months, if not years.
So the other thing that's also fascinating about that is just thinking about how any organization grows. People always say, well, we don't want to specialize. Well, you had to specialize. We don't want to have centralization. Well, you actually have to have some authority system. Totally. And then classic organization, you get to a decentralized, you got to start gluing things together. So this is all in 6 weeks.
I know. It's been so crazy. So I'll answer your question about the type of projects. What's been amazing is just the diversity of projects, and anyone who wants to go to our website to volunteer, or anyone who might be listening who needs help, usdigitalresponse.org. And we also have a page there with lots of sample projects, but just the ones I've seen come across our table. And they came kind of in waves as the pandemic started to, become a bigger crisis. And as the East Coast and especially New York got hit, we went through these phases of, first it was about information gathering, putting up a website, communication to constituents, and then it was handling hospital data and outbreak data and how do you aggregate and visualize it. And then it was deficiencies in inventory and PPE and how do you model it and how do you route it. If new equipment was coming into a state, where were they going to send it? And then we had a whole symptom checker phase. And when I say phase, I mean 2 days. Like for 2 days, symptom checkers were all the rage for 2 days. And then 100 people built a symptom checker, and then nobody talked about it anymore. And then we, jobs boards for unemployed people, small business loans. We put up a website for New Jersey where the small business loans, I think we already had 50,000 people check their eligibility and more than $350 million requested from that one website. We helped with call to serve, or how do you activate volunteers to go into FEMA centers, long-term care facilities, because nursing homes were really hit. And then this whole wave of pandemic unemployment insurance, PUA, which is part of the CARES Act. And suddenly people were eligible for unemployment that had never been before, like gig workers and self-employed people. But that broke every government insurance, unemployment insurance or unemployment site, because they're all written on COBOL, they're all 1970s code, like everything broke that week. Contact tracing, test site, test aggregation, reopen society plans. So that's like a whole swarm of things. And all of those probably came across our desk in the first month.
That's just crazy. So you just went through this sort of rapid fire that you did all this stuff in the first month. But when it comes to scaling, there's a whole bunch of people going in deep, including you. So one thing we discussed before was kind of the New Jersey story.
Yeah.
I thought it was sort of so you've been heavily involved in this week while you're in Sacramento doing a second job, but you're still doing the New Jersey job too. So why don't you describe how that came together and what you sort of learned in the process?
Yeah, so I think one thing we decided early on is that our government partners should have a single point of contact at USDR, which we called an account manager. Okay. So by my third day, we started the first video call with USDR, and by my third day, I was already the product manager for a symptom checker. I was in charge of something called PPE Coalition, which was a marketplace that Eric restarted. I was the account manager for New Jersey, and I had some other job, I can't remember. And I think for me, the New Jersey relationship has been the most fruitful one because from that day that I became their account manager for 53 days in a row, I had to stand up with them every single day. And like we all saw in the news, New Jersey and New York were unusually hit and had, outbreaks and challenges that many other states wouldn't face till later or haven't faced yet. And so I think what was powerful is that daily stand-up was sort of information sharing in both directions. Sort of they would ask, this small business loan site, we would put volunteers on them. They're executing a project. I worked with them on a call to serve project, which was really about a form to get retired medical staff to come back to work. But they wanted to do automated background checks and automated checks against a New Jersey database. And so information was flowing, from me to them as we were working on projects. But then they would also say, this is what's hot here. This is what we was thinking coming down the line or what's coming next week. PPE for return to work was not an issue week 1, but in week 7, we were talking about PPE for return to work. And so then I could take that information and spread it across USDR, which now has account managers like me and nodes of the network in all other states and cities or lots of states and cities. And so I think that was a really powerful, just the constant communication and building that relationship helped it become a really important node for the whole USDR.
So let's talk about how you scaled it out in a minute, but I'm also just curious. I mean, you've had a lot of different roles in a lot of different organizations. What was it about what you did before that prepared you to be able to do this? Because this is technology, management, politics, and organizational structure sort of all at once.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think any of us asked if we were capable. No, none of this was, I think a lot of us were just, when you see a crisis and you think you can help, you want to help. And a lot of, we put up an oath and we asked people to join USDR to agree to our mission. And it's sort of we're not the heroes, the frontline workers are the heroes. We're there to support them. Their work comes first. We'll get them water if they need it. We'll take out the trash if they need it. And so I think that was the DNA, and sort of no matter what your skill set is, we can find things for you to do at USDR. I will say at the Hillary campaign, I grew a team from 0 to 80 people in just over 1 year. And that used to feel fast to me.
I remember you were talking about that. So that was easy.
and I think I asked everyone to move to Brooklyn. So I'm like, wow, what a luxury that everyone showed up there in person. What a luxury that I could walk to anyone's desk and talk to them. What a luxury that we could have social norms. And anyways, I think that prepared me, but I also worked on Google's crisis response team. And we were the ones who in a natural disaster would help put up tools or update our maps or route resources or whatever it took, search one boxes or things that would help in a crisis. I think what's different here, and I'm sitting with a lot of people in the California state government, is just a lot of our DNA is sort of there's an event and then it's over, like an earthquake or a flood or a fire, and then we recover. And what's happening now is we're in the event, and the event is persisting and it's not going anywhere. And this living every day inside of the event is just a new thing we haven't confronted before. So we were probably all learning new stuff.
So you never know what's going to end. So the other part, so that's fascinating. So I didn't know that you'd actually worked in disaster response at Google. So you've done that as well. One of the things that we're talking about a little bit in preparation for this is this notion that, okay, so you started some stuff in New Jersey. This is a classic scaling problem. And then there's other places you need to move it to. So what have you learned about this sort of spreading about, Hagi Rao and I call this the Buddhism Catholicism problem. So Catholicism is where you do everything exactly the same everywhere, but that actually doesn't usually work for scaling. You got to go a little Buddhist and add and do some adaptation. So how are you working on that tension in USDR?
Yeah, I think a really good example of that is contact tracing. So most of us, when we say contact tracing, mean human contact tracing. So not the Google, Apple digital Bluetooth API, the tracing API. We mean actual like 1950s epidemiology. Thousands of people are on the phones. And when somebody tests positive, we call you, we say, we're so sorry. What are the services you need? Can you quarantine at home? Do you need food? Do you need childcare? And then we have to ask them, like, who have you spent time with in the last 14 days? And then we call those people. And to lift up a contact tracing system is incredibly complex, especially when you're trying to integrate with existing epidemiology systems. And all of these are cross-agency and cross-state and local government projects. And so what we found is that when we worked with a state like California or Massachusetts, which is, I would say, ahead of the game, like, you know, Massachusetts is probably 4 weeks into their implementation, New York's 10 days, California is probably 3 weeks in. What we want to do is not copy or repeat, I don't know what your language was, Buddhism versus Catholicism.
It's replication versus local adaptation is the customization versus perfect replication is really the tension.
Yeah, and so what I would say here is adaptation is the key. So it doesn't help me as somebody who's working in California to tell somebody in Hawaii or Connecticut or Wyoming what I did. If, you know, just handing them over the vendor list, like buy these vendors, that's not going to work because number one, it's incredibly expensive. But number two, so much of what we picked was custom to the internal IT systems that already exist. But the components of a tracing system, like, okay, you need to hire 10,000 people. You need them to work from home. You need them to have headphones. You need a training academy. You need, you know, some sort of pit boss system, and people have to monitor quality. And then you need a script, and then you need the infrastructure for, you know, the actual like resources for people who can't quarantine at home and where to send them. And there's all these like pieces of a puzzle, and data and analytics and reporting. And once we get our contact tracing up, we want it to influence where we put our test sites. So we're trying to make sure that nobody has to drive more than half an hour to get a test. So this is going to influence everything. So the components are repeatable, even if the implementation is local or custom. And I think that's been a big lesson of USDR. The more we can put up like playbooks or models that can be adapted, the more powerful it is.
So that's really, so one of I think our mutual friends, Michael Deering, who's done a lot of scaling. He's actually the guy who came up with the Buddhism Catholicism distinction. We stole it from him. But his argument is that when you've got to scale, the first thing you got to do is kind of have a playbook, something that works once in one place, and then as you spread it, you've got to adapt it to meet the local needs. But that's a great thing. But you're doing this all in weeks, so it's just sort of remarkable. So let's, in terms of timing, since we started early, let me ask you just a couple more questions, and maybe for my team out there, maybe in about 5 or 6 minutes, we'll go to Q&A. Does that work? Okay.
Yep.
So let's do that. Okay. So one of the things before we get to some takeaways, maybe you could talk a little bit about, to the extent that you can, about what are you doing in Sacramento? So you're working on U.S. digital response, but you're also part of physically a team in Sacramento. So what are you doing for the state of California? Since this is a newer adventure, you've been there 2 weeks or something. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you know, I mentioned it. Not shockingly, you won't be surprised, I'm working on contact tracing, which is why that playbook is so important to me, and all the components are so important to me. And to me, as a builder and a technologist, this is the thing I am good at. Like, okay, you need to put 20,000 people on the phone in 2 weeks. You have to build integration. We have 61 local health jurisdictions in California, and they all have their different systems. They all have to choose whether or not they opt into the state system. You need to like win the hearts and minds of these people. You need to figure out really hairy technical problems. That's very much in my wheelhouse. And so Todd Park, it's another network connection. You know, you were saying, how did all these things get started? Todd Park is a old friend of mine. He was Obama's second CTO. He's a healthcare entrepreneur who's done a lot of great things. He was already embedded in the government. And as the contact tracing thing blew up, he asked Jen Polka, who's the founder of Code for America, also a founder of USDR. They were like, we need an Uber product manager, but not, you know, somebody who can get in a car and come here right now and can build something on the scale of like a Google Maps. And they were like, we know her. And a lot of, you know, if you're trying to lift up something that major in 2 weeks, this is also one of the tenets of of USDR, first you go there and you listen and you try to understand what needs to be, what the problem statement is, what problem they're trying to solve. And it's the wrong thing to say like, great, I'll hire 50 engineers and we'll build that from you. What we needed to do was evaluate a lot of vendor and decide how to piece them all together. Like we might use somebody different for training than for the case management system than for other pieces. And so really what I've been doing is like at rapid scale, trying to help put together the components of the California contact tracing tech infrastructure.
So I want to, in a couple of minutes, ask you some closing questions, but there's something that I just wonder if you have any thoughts about. So one of the things that really strikes me, and in fact is true of all three of the guests that we're going to have here, is it seems like, well, there's all these bad things that have happened in the last 2 months, but one of the shocking good things is there's all these things that seem like they would take years to do in government, in business, and then they're done in weeks. So do you have any thoughts about why that's possible and how to do it right?
Well, Beth is the CIO of New Jersey, and she's an incredible talent. And she said in one of her webinars that she's never seen such openness and collaboration in government. Like it's spanning agencies and discipline and local and state. And it's just people are breaking down barriers, and like procurement, for some of the procurement stuff I've worked on that's happened in 4 or 6, 8 days. From what I understand, that would be a multi-year process in the regular era. So I think, I cannot say this enough. I'm so happy to have an audience to say it to. First of all, the USDR people are working insanely hard. We're all volunteers. Like we're staying up all night. We're doing everything on the weekend, like incredible passion and commitment from USDR. But I would say from government service, like insane. Like they're working harder than I've ever seen across, public health and emergency services and the governor's office, and just like extreme dedication. And I think the reason is it's a crisis. Like people are coming together in a way that's because it's literally life or death. And what I would say, what we're hoping, at least on the government side, is the disruption that's happening now, the breaking down of traditional tech systems. For pandemic unemployment assistance, we're essentially building a parallel system to the 1970s COBOL system to make it work. The phrase we use a lot here is build back better. We don't want this to be a moment in time, and then all of this is like, whew, at some point we go back to like the way it was. What we're hoping is that these are lessons about the way of work, about how we implement technology, about what's possible, that will forever disrupt how we do, how governments do their work.
Well, so I mean, it is fascinating. I think of governments, but we've both been in large organizations. You end up having people in silos who either don't know each other or see each other as the enemy. But then when you've got a bigger challenge, then people actually come together. So that with all of the problems, it is lovely to hear that. Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple wrap-up questions, and then let's go to Q&A, and I'll keep going until Chris stops me. Just looking back, so you've been involved in fast scaling, slow scaling. You've been involved in some unsuccessful scaling. So what are your kind of top two? If you're gonna just sort of give your headlines, your final slide in the talk, your final takeaway, what are your top two?
Okay, so because we talked about this, I wrote my top two is defined roles and responsibility. Like it doesn't sound sexy, but I think the more you define roles and responsibilities, the more your team can act autonomously. And that isn't just roles and responsibilities, but it's also goals. Google, we would call them OKRs, and you want to set OKRs on a quarterly basis or whatever is right. At USDR, it's probably on a 5-day basis. But you want to have alignment on roles and responsibility goals, and then you want to give teams a lot of autonomy. And the thing you need to do as a leader is decide what cadence of check-in you're going to have and what decisions needed to be escalated to your level. And if I take the Hillary campaign as an example, I had a product manager who was in charge of online fundraising. And so her goal could be, in this quarter, you need to raise $45 million online. And if I told her that on day 1 and didn't ask her how it was going till day 89, we're in trouble.
Right.
Or if I left her out there to figure it out by herself with no support and assistant, that wouldn't be a good experience either. So I think, having the right goal, but also the cadence of check-ins, and also knowing what decisions have to be escalated to what level. It sounds kind of rigid or maybe even boring, but I think those are the foundational pieces that let you scale rapidly.
So that's, and one of the things that both Chris and I see over and over again in organizations that work well without too much authoritarianism is these sort of cadence where everybody sort of knows when they're going to check in, when things are due, really important. Okay.
Oh, I have a second thing. I have a second thing.
Yes.
To end on fun. So the other thing I just say, my lesson from massive scale, Google in the early days, led Gmail to 100 million active users. You got to have fun, and fun can look and feel like different things. At the Hillary campaign, we had no money, but a lot of us came from Google. And at Google, you could give anyone a peer bonus, PEER, at any time, a peer bonus. And at Google, it's money. So at the Hillary campaign, we started giving pair bonuses, PEAR. And somebody would leave, if you wanted to say something nice to a coworker, you would leave a pair on the desk.
Like a physical pair.
A physical pair. And then like halfway through the campaign, I found these like really hilarious fake pairs, and we made headbands. And so then you would like pass the headband and somebody would wear it. Or at the USDR, we don't have, we've never met each other in person. We do everything on Zoom. Somehow, when we wanted to celebrate something, we started doing something we call a stretch clap, which is we haven't moved in a while. And we're trying to show you, so you see a screen of like 25 people going like this, we're celebrating you. And it makes no sense, but we're like in love with stretch clap, and we made an emoji for Slack, and we talk about it all the time. So I just wanted to say the second thing is cultural norms and fun.
That's fabulous. Okay, so Laura's going to take over now. She's going to ask you some questions. It's a delight to talk to you. Laura, you're on.
Hi.
Thanks, Bob.
So I've been monitoring our Twitter feed, which has been popping up with a lot of really great questions. And there's a couple questions that have been coming up, particularly around how does this apply to education? And I just read a question just now. I'm going to add it to our banner so that we can see it. But one question that just came from Twitter, which was great about scaling. This person asked, how do we make such scaling or collaboration in general sustainable? Is fast scaling only applicable to crisis solving? Or I would add to that question, in a crisis mode, scaling sometimes takes a long time. And is this kind of fast scaling model that you're seeing applicable only during this moment of crisis?
Okay, I think that's a wonderful question. My first reaction is it would be really hard to generate these conditions in most regular business or commercial or government environments. But I have seen in my career that you can have other impending things that help you create urgency, like you're going to run out of money if you're at a startup and you don't get something to work pretty quickly, or there's a competitor, and if you don't get something out before they do, the window of opportunity will be missed. So in my professional career, I have been a big fan of creating imaginary crises, which in my Google days, I would call it a Larry Sergey demo. Like I would just get them to commit and say, this day, 40 days from now, Larry and Sergey are going to show up in this office and we're going to show them our work. And believe me, that was a motivating factor. So I don't think it's easy to replicate anything near the scale of what we're doing, but I think trying to think about your organization and what, if it's not urgent yet, like what are the barriers? How do you reduce friction, and how do you maybe create those moments?
That's great. Where a lot of the questions are coming up, and one of our colleagues, Michael Crawford, a lot of the talk you're talking about is around collaboration and connection. And one of the things, and having time for that. And oftentimes that we're seeing, particularly right now in this moment, overnight educators, that people are turned in and there's not a lot of time for collaboration, deep thinking. And so what would you say to kind of people who are not giving them time for collaboration and connection? What would you say to convince them to provide more time for that collaboration and community work?
So this is a time when I wish I had the person asking the question on the line, because I'm not sure if I know the question is about kind of personal connection, or is it about separating tactical from strategy? What do you think?
I'll put in the banner right there. And so the question is really like in education, often the case is educators do not get ample time for collaboration or even get to know each other really at all, right? So how would you convince education leaders to make time for this type of connection?
Okay, got it. It's a great question. I'm trying to think, it's invaluable. I think about the best moments on USDR so far was our first show and tell, where we put people who had been working in similar problems in Pennsylvania or Michigan or California on visualization of hospital data. And those people hadn't met each other yet, but they're all working on a similar problem. And we were just moving too fast to make all the connections. Or if you think about the contact tracers we're going to lift up here in California, even before the first one is on the phone, we're already talking about what are the forums where we can put them together and share learnings, because this is high emotional intelligence work. You have to tell somebody potentially who's gotten some bad news that you need to extract a lot of location history and contact information from them, and it's not easy. So we're already talking about best practices. And so to the person who answers the question, I always say like case studies. To tell somebody it's important is like going to fall on deaf ears. To say, here are 3 things that have worked. Here are ideas that came out of this type of forum. And, you know, if we try it, and also pitching things as an experiment, like it's not like sign up for 1 hour every week in perpetuity, but can we experiment with this kind of unique forum for sharing and learning beyond the tactical of our day-to-day work. So that's my advice, case studies, and then pitching it as a not for everything, but an experiment. And it's, I think it's something people would be up for trying.
That's great. And I'll do one more. And this is from another one of our watchers and a Stanford student. And her question is like, how do you really create urgency when there isn't, particularly in government organizations or in education, there isn't a large sense of urgency to get things done quickly. So how do you create urgency to get things done?
I love this question. It's such a good question. I'm a person who's neither worked in government or education. So I think my tactics, you know, I've always worked in incredibly fast-moving environments. If you think about a political campaign or the early days of Google or what we're going through now with this pandemic, I think, you know, as I talked about, I'm a product manager. So product manager has to identify friction. You have to identify stakeholders. You have to, you know, make ambitious goals. You have to inspire, and you have to get people moving towards something kind of big and ambitious. And I think those tactics and those like roles that you do would apply across different disciplines. And for me, I like can't stress enough, like creating the urgency by, you know, whatever it is for you. We're applying for a grant and there's a deadline, or there's this national test and we want to, you know, do this amazing thing for our students. Like, how can you look at your environment and figure out what the equivalent of my Larry and Sergey demo is and make that happen in your org?
Great. And we keep have a lot of questions coming in from our audience, and I'm sure they're going to continue to come. A couple more questions that I'll put out there. You know, how do you think of scaling and prevailing in education? What does scale look like to you in, I would say, in specifically K-12 education?
Oh my gosh, it's such a great question. I don't think I'm uniquely qualified. We must have a lot of amazing educators on the line, which is so cool. I think the same, like, how do you create best practices? How do you put people who have been successful and creative into a room together? How do you find organizations that can promote and lift up best practices? How do you look for tech entrepreneurs, especially in this era? You know, my friend Carl is the founder of Seesaw, an amazing company that I know has been so critical for the new virtual home learning environment. I know Google Education and Google Classroom critical. So I wish I knew more. To whoever is asking these questions, I so wish I had more DNA of being an educator, but I think the same attempts to find the thought leaders, find technology innovators, lift up best practices, and share.
And then I'll probably put the last question that I just put on there. Elizabeth asked, given that you just mentioned practices and structures, what new practices have you implemented for remote work that other organizations can learn from, or in education in particular?
So I think when you're remote, you have to work even harder on the communication angle. You have to over document, because you can often leave a room thinking different things or not realizing what decisions have been approved. And there's just no more of that casual, like looking over your shoulder and asking people. When the Zoom is off, it's sort of done. So I think over documenting on agendas, over documenting on sort of takeaways, decisions, action items. You know, trying to do, like in USDR, we're doing things like before you speak in one of our core team meetings, we have a question that you have to answer, which is something like, what's making you happy today? Or what's the first restaurant you're going to go to when you can go to a restaurant? When we have dead time in meetings, we do funny things in Zoom chat. Like, we're like, okay, give props to somebody who did something nice for you today. And if there's 40 people on the meeting, suddenly you see all these like amazing comments roll by. And then I think you need the, like, how do you make time for the like mental health check-ins? Just people are suffering, like everyone's suffering. Parents at home are suffering. People who lost their jobs are suffering. We're tired. We're scared. We don't know when the world's going to go back to anything close to what it is. So overly emphasizing the like, what do you need? I don't think people like the question, how are you? I don't think people like the question, how are you holding up? But what do you need? Can I help you? Is there something that would make it easier to do the work you need to do? Like, let me help you. Let me support you in this era.
That's great. Well, I just want to, for one, just thank you. I learned so much in this short amount of stint of like, not only from the comments and the suggestions that you're offering, and then from the questions that our community are asking on Twitter, and the deep questions of how you are really in service right now to the broader community, and how you work faster, smarter, right, in order to scale the innovations that are trying to help people, bottom line. And I think that all of us come together for this unique time right now to really help people. And I just want to thank you for leading the inspiration to making this happen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all the people who asked questions.
Thanks.
Great. So, Steph, I wanted to thank you as well. It's just always such a delight to see you. And just a comment, just watching you, and I've known Steph for a long time. So Steph's always had this ability to create calm when there's hysteria, and then urgency when people are too calm. And I think you can sort of see it in the way she thinks, in the way that she talks about things. So Steph, thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your great feeling with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Such an honor to be here. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, that was a fantastic way to kick things off. By the way, we'll note that there's actually a relationship between Steph and our next speaker, Enrico. They were classmates at my alma mater, Harvard Business School. So it's amazing the kinds of connections that exist. Next on our list is Laura is going to talk a little bit about the great work that the D.school does. So Laura, why don't you take it away, and then we'll bring on Enrico.
That's great. Thank you. So I am standing here in the D.school tonight, and we have many people watching tonight. And tonight, the speakers that we have here are really reacting to the conditions that are happening in the world, from education, technology, healthcare, and all of us are coming together here at the D.school to also think about how we can effectively and equitably design offerings to help educators, families, students who obviously are struggling right now in this moment, and how they find their way forward. And what I love about, I was thinking this morning, what I love about this panel is that it's so demonstrative of the D.school, is that we bring people from diverse backgrounds, from different industries, and are coming together to solve complex challenges. And I think there's nothing more unique than that. What we do at the D.school is to bring people from different disciplines and different backgrounds to selectively, collectively design and solve these complex challenges. I definitely know that design for us is a team sport. And so there is no way that we can make our way through this next round and this next stage of our life without listening and connecting with people from all fields. And I think that is the way forward. And we believe design is a tool that can help us there. And so our K-12 lab has been doing lots of things, including this pop-up tonight, to bring ideas, to bring inspiration to many people to think about how they're going to react and face. And so last week, our lab did a hackathon for over 100 people from around the globe, looking at how we might really empathize with students right now, how we might connect educators, and how we might help families who become overnight educators. And so we have resources that we can share with folks. We're also doing scenario planning to help schools think about how they might design for fall 2020, knowing that they might have to design 10 schedules because they don't know what the conditions will be. And we've got resources on that. Our exec ed team are thinking about basically career counseling, especially for folks who have been furloughed, laid off, and how they can use design to reimagine their careers right now. And then, of course, we have all of our offerings here at the D.school, including a D.school starter kit for folks who are curious about design. So I'll stop there, but you can see and learn more about all of the work that the K-12 lab is doing. And thank you, Chris and Bob, for sharing. And again, Stephanie and our other speakers for bringing your wisdom tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. And again, I'm such an admirer of the D.school. We should mention that our very own Bob Sutton is one of the co-founders of the D.school. So in many ways, the building that you're sitting in right now is the building that Bob helped build. So huge thanks to Bob for doing that. So next up in our lineup, our second speaker of the night is going to be my friend Enrico D'Angelo, the VP of Product over at Roblox. Enrico has a really strong background in video gaming. He's been doing this for a very long time. But I don't know Enrico because of our video games. I, in fact, know Enrico as from our frequent games of Dungeons & Dragons, where he plays Rester. a wizard whose fire magic terrifies his enemies. But we are going to focus tonight on Enrico's role at Roblox and his perspective on the video game industry. As I mentioned, Enrico is also a classmate of Steph's from HBS, class of 2004. So Enrico, such a delight to have you here today.
Thank you, Chris. And that was amazing, Steph. By the way, I really wish I can be like you when I grow up. I can only talk about video games, so hopefully that will be as interesting and entertaining as what you did. And obviously, thank you, Chris, Bob, and Laura, and Mark for having me tonight, and for the opportunity to discuss scaling in games and also sharing the Roblox story in this unique time. So again, this is a really unique time for our industry. We're seeing dynamics we've never experienced before, and reacting swiftly has been super critical. So what I'm going to cover is first a couple of different scaling models for gaming companies, and then focus on how Roblox leverage its scaling philosophy to cope with the current situation and provide relief to our user community. Maybe we can get the presentation going. Next page. Okay, so I've been very lucky to be able to launch products and features across many platforms at two of the most exciting, at least in my opinion, companies in the gaming industry, Activision, Blizzard, and Roblox. And that has given me the opportunity to observe and learn about different approaches to scaling. One is what I call the franchise-driven approach, and one is the systems-driven approach. So just a little blurb on Activision. I've been there for 6 years. In my mind, this is the best company at scaling through franchises. It is a massive public company with more than 10,000 employees, around 400 million monthly active users that play their games, several large studios, large studio meaning 100 plus, it could be 200-300 people working on individual games. And they make massive franchises you probably have heard of, such as Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, or Candy Crush, among others. There are actually many more. Roblox is actually the company I'm at right now. I spent the last couple of years there. I run product teams around economy, ecosystems, and monetization. So Roblox DNA is 100% systems driven. Roblox is a smaller private company, around 700 people, with more than 120 million active users each month. It does not own any studio, nor any content creation capability, which is interesting for a company that makes money off of content, and operates a central team in San Mateo that provides a free tool, tech, and a social graph and access to a huge audience to anybody willing to create and publish 3D experiences. So we really don't touch anything. We just give people the tools and then they go out and do amazing things. So there are several micro franchises on the platform, individually not at the scale of Activision's, but they're all organic and they're all 100% made by the user community. So let's start talking about the two models, and then I'll talk about specifically Roblox in COVID. So next page. So let's start with the franchise-driven philosophy. So how does it work? So I think about it in three steps: prove, grow, and stack. So the proof phase is when the company invests internal resources, which are both content development and marketing, to create a game with mass market appeal and the potential for extensibility to more products. So the company has a point of view on what works in the market and builds a product around that point of view, and then markets it to make sure that the target audience knows it exists and gets excited about it. So if the product proves market fit, then the company focuses on growing it. That's the second phase, which means a couple of things. First, the company runs the game as a service to maximize the lifetime value of each user through retention, engagement, and monetization initiatives. This could include, for example, content updates or events, competitions, in-game discounts, re-engagement campaigns, among many other things that these companies do. The second is that the company turns that product that proves success into a franchise and starts planning more products under the same banner. So these follow-on products tend to have lower risk, obviously, because the product market fit has already been proven. So these guys are basically banking on the success of the first product. So the third phase is stacking. So this is the process of creating new games and franchises and adding them on top of existing ones. So especially for public company, it is vital to continue showing growth, and no franchise grows forever, although some companies think they do, but they don't. Hence, companies following the franchise-driven approach are constantly either developing new franchises in-house or looking for acquisitions to add to their portfolio. So here, if you look at these charts to the right, I'm showing a couple of illustrative graphs where I'm taking a theoretical scenario where a company creates and stacks a bunch of successful franchises. So you can see, if you look at the top graph, you have a bunch of individual franchises, each franchise has a curve, so it grows, it peaks, and then it basically bottoms out. But when you stack them, you can see that basically that causes the growth or supports the growth of the company as a whole. You also see in the bottom graph that margins grow, but while they're growing, the variability of these margins reduces over time. So the reason why the latter happens is that as more and more franchises stack, total revenues become increasingly stratified across multiple products. And then you have a long tail of revenues, which is made by the sum of individual franchises' long tails. And that long tail gets fatter and more predictable, which is why you see margin variability essentially decreasing over time. So this decreases the overall company risk of introducing new products by mitigating revenues and margin variability. And this means that the more successful a company is at this model, the more risks it can take over time without majorly affecting KPIs. So now let's move to the next page, which is sort of an overview of the systems-driven approach, which is, again, what basically Roblox really embodies, I think, better than any gaming company I know. So a systematic approach starts from a completely different premise vis-a-vis the franchise one. And the premise is that whereas the franchise model assumes that launching popular content is something that can be mastered over time, systems believers assume that it's impossible to consistently identify what the market wants and to execute on it. So maybe you know what they want, but then what you make is actually not as good as what the market expects. So instead of investing in individual ideas or trends, this approach really focuses on the problem or solves the problem by putting a set of systems in place for the market to dictate what they want, to make it, and to monetize it. And what the company does is simply to take a cut of whatever the market generates. So in this in this approach, the paradigm is very different. So again, I think of it as a seed, nurture, and iterate. So in the seeding phase, what the company does is it focuses resources on creating and distributing technology, tools, and economic incentives. That's actually what I personally do at Roblox, for the developer community to be compelled and able to create content. And then for the user community, the gamers, to find it, enjoy it, and being able to pay for it. So once these systems are in place and this virtual circle of content creation to user engagement to monetization to more content creation starts, then the company nurtures it by investing in removing any friction in the system. So for example, making tools more accessible or make content more discoverable, and really focus on staying super close to the communities, both the user community and the developer community, to increase trust in the system. And community health is the company's North Star. So the company is there to serve the community. So the company learns what's working, what isn't working, goes back to the drawing board and improves its systems using community feedback, redeploys them in a never-ending loop. And that's the third phase, which is really not a third phase. It's really like a loop between the first and the second phase. So content is constantly created, transformed, killed, reinvented throughout this process. And some experiences are very successful because they hit that sweet spot, and other experiences are not. But to be clear, these are not the company's successes or failures. These are the communities. And so the company's success is effectively serving the community, and content and monetization is really a byproduct of that mission. So this all sounds great, but it could be extremely long process that can take years before this flywheel effect that I described really is fully realized. And so tools need to be learned and adopted. In some cases, the tools are rough and needs refinement. Tech needs to mature. A large connected user community needs to form before individuals start looking at the platform as a destination. A big deal for Roblox is the social aspects and the social network. And so people play because there are other people playing. And if that doesn't happen, obviously the platform as a whole is less compelling. And which is why if you look at the chart on the top right, you see revenues being low and flat for a while until all the benefits of the ecosystem kick in, and then growth starts, which is where you see that hockey stick. You also see margin being flat. And here, this is a simplifying assumption I made to draw this graph. I'm simplifying the margin definition by just netting out the cost of content. So this doesn't include other costs. So the reason is that the company participate in the community success by taking a fixed cut, but the company does not own the economics. So that's a model that on one end allows the company to survive setbacks, but it also doesn't really lend itself to economies of scale, at least when it comes to content costs. So now next page, I'm gonna sort of try and compare the two models. So it goes without saying that they can both be very compelling, but no one is perfect. So the franchise model on the plus side can generate massive economies of scale because the cost of making a game are mostly fixed. And so the more successful a game is post-launch, the higher the margins. And also scaling post-launch can happen pretty fast with the right franchise. And in fact, it's interesting that most franchises that do not scale right away are deemed unsuccessful. So after 6 to 12 months, if the franchise doesn't really scale, they're abandoned and the company moves resources to the next idea.
It's like a Hollywood movie.
It's very, very similar. That's exactly right. The difference is that in a Hollywood movie, you make money when the movie launches, and then there's no way to monetize it further through live ops. I mean, you can release it on multiple platforms and formats, whereas in games, you can actually make a ton of money by just adding content and adding events and things like that. But it's fundamentally the same, yes.
Did you ever have a release where you felt it was going to be a massive hit, but it was disappointing? You don't have to name the release. How did it feel as the guy launching the franchise?
Yeah, yes. It was actually, I would say, Guitar Hero. I mean, when I was at Activision, it was a huge franchise back in the days. And then we relaunched it with an idea that we thought was actually really interesting, which was this idea of not only playing fixed song, but they were actually streaming channel where you can actually play and jump in and play music as the music streamed. It was a big bet for the company. We thought we would bring this huge IP back, and that underperformed vis-a-vis expectations. And you can imagine for Guitar Hero, there were additional costs because not only you had to make the game, you also had to make all the plastic guitars, and you need to basically make all the inventory, in advance. And so you can imagine, I mean, these massive costs are even more massive when there's a physical component to the product. So in a systems-driven approach, the biggest benefit is really the ability for a company to start small, set a platform-level long-term vision, and iterate towards it without having to worry about covering massive upfront costs. And also, it's the community, not the company, carries the content market fit risk, which is different from the franchise model, obviously, because the franchise model, the company itself, carries that risk. However, there is a platform-level product market fit risk, but that is mostly upfront. And once the platform is proven, that risk gets dramatically mitigated. And I would argue that the more open and the more flexible the platform is, the more the platform allows you to do, the lower the risk is going forward. A platform like Roblox allows you to make games. We're working on enabling video. Obviously, it's a social graph as well. So there's so many things that user can do and create that makes the platform more immune to this type of risk.
Now, one of the interesting things about Roblox is I think a lot of your users are fairly young. They're kids, right?
Yeah.
So how does that affect things? How does that allow you, when you're doing a community based around kids and parents, what complications does that bring?
Well, so there's a lot of there's complications, but also there's a lot of opportunities. So a lot of the folks that make Roblox games that are successful on the platform used to be players. In fact, almost 100% of them started as players, and they loved the community. They became really passionate about it and invested first their time and their energy, and then at some point they started making games for fun, just to make their friends happier or to just share their creations. And over time, this became a hobby and then a part-time job and a full job, and now they're actually employing people to actually work for them to scale these games even further.
So there's like 12-year-old kids who are running their own studios on Roblox?
Not quite 12-year-olds, but early 20s, early to mid 20s probably. I would argue that I probably know one person that is like early 30s, but everybody else is younger than that. I mean, these guys are like great entrepreneurs. They get it. They're smart, and they know what works, right? and so they get better all the time. So again, so that's, I think one of the opportunities that we essentially have with a pipeline of user, like player to developer. And so you start playing when you're younger, but then as you mature, you can become, and some people do become developers. And that essentially is when the vision of Roblox comes full circle. Obviously, dealing with a younger audience has a lot of implications for safety. We have a huge team doing content moderation. Since we actually own the whole tech stack, we actually can monitor every single asset that every single developer, and we have 2 million of them, so we have a large community. Every single blade of grass that somebody puts in a game, we actually see it and we approve it, right? And so there's a ton that we do to make sure that the content on the platform is really clean and is enjoyable by as many people as possible. So, and we have a huge, trust and safety team. There's a ton that we do, for that. So do you want me to continue? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let me quickly touch on the cons. So on the flip side, I think at this point, some of the cons have become apparent. The franchise-driven approach requires massive upfront investments in content creation and marketing, and these investments are often made following an hypothesis on what will work. And when things go south, individual misses can significantly affect the company's performance, because it's a lot of money you're betting on one idea. And by the way, the product market fit risk never really goes away, because every time you introduce a new franchise, now you're taking that, that content risk again. Again, the Guitar Hero example was a great one where Activision was super successful, new franchise, and again, things didn't pan out as the company expected. Also, aging franchises, even the most popular one, are a ticking time bomb. Really, it's rare to see a franchise that decline and then grows again. Typically, the trajectory only goes in one direction, which means that when decline starts, the company needs to quickly start finding substitutes. And finally, franchises are really built by these massive studio organizations that have their own culture, history, and views around what's cool and what's fun. And so if the market changes, adapting can be a multi-year process. And in many cases, that doesn't happen. Like, studios are not able to sort of, reinvent themselves to hit these new market needs. It's worth noting that some of these risks are mitigated as the company succeeds and portfolio grows, but they never go away. And when it comes to the system-driven company, as I mentioned before, there's a tipping point, but before you hit the tipping point, it's really a hard and long process. And before that happens, that tipping point happens, the signals of success might be weak. So it can be hard to tell whether you're not there yet, but you're on the right path, or whether you will never get there. And, Roblox was started in 2005 or 6, but you probably haven't heard about it, up until 5 years ago. So that was a great story of resiliency by our CEO that just believed in his vision, just kept plowing through. Although again, these early days were not as glamorous as what we're experiencing right now. What else? So related to this is the chicken and egg problem, right? So where great content grows your user community, but you need a big user community to create large enough economic incentives for developers to build content. So when the flywheel doesn't work, essentially you have nothing. And finally, again, as I mentioned before, the economies of scale in this approach are limited compared to the franchise model, because the content economics are shared. So this is just an overview of the two models, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about Roblox and, again, how systems-driven approach allows to, I think, be a pretty unique player in COVID. So next page. So just taking a step back on COVID-19 and gaming. So shelter-in-place drove massive traffic to all home entertainment, but in particular towards games. So the most popular gaming destinations are experiencing an all-time high in terms of user volume, concurrent users, and also engagement, time spent in these games. And our industry has never seen anything like this, and no one was really prepared, to be honest. So just to give you a few data points, according to Verizon, in the US alone, there's been a 75% increase in video game usage during peak hours. And if you think of that and you compare it with the uptick in video streaming, that is 12%. So 75 versus 12. So in Italy, that is obviously a country that was very affected by COVID. Internet traffic increased 70%. The majority of it was driven by Fortnite. So this is to say, these figures are staggering. So this is a first in the industry, no matter how long you work in it. So what's even more interesting, though, in my opinion, is that shelter in place drove new behaviors in games. So users not only are playing more, but they're leveraging games with strong social elements in new ways. So they're trying to find ways to replace real-world, in-person activities that are not possible, obviously, these days, with equivalent one in virtual worlds. So examples go from sports events or live music, and even a school graduation or just hanging out with your friends. And so, next page. So COVID has, on one side created, tech scaling challenges for a large platform like Roblox, but also opportunities for us to leverage our community-driven approach to support all of our COVID relief initiatives. So on the tech scaling side, this is kind of boring, but just I need to mention it. So we focused on making our services more scalable to meet the higher volume of calls driven by this massive increase of users. We increased server capacity to make sure that every single user had a smooth experience with no wait times and smooth server performance. But again, what I think is more interesting and personally inspiring is how Roblox used its systems and community to address the human challenges posed by shelter in place. So we talked about new use cases for games with users looking for virtual spaces to perform social activities and connect with friends. And so to address that, we offered heavy discounts and free private servers on our biggest and most popular social games to allow people to organize their own social gatherings on the platform. So this was an effort that was driven through our community of developers that volunteered to offer these benefits. We didn't build anything. So you can see a few screenshots at the bottom. The first is from a virtual graduation ceremony. Is actually the daughter of our head of marketing. The second was a virtual birthday party where kids just chat and basically play together. And the third is this huge event called the One World Together at Home concert, that we hosted in a virtual space. So you could watch this on TV if you wanted to. But in our experience, not only you could watch it on this big stream, but you could also perform activities together, watch the show together, chat. There was there was mini games that you could play around the 3D space while watching the concert. So it was a more immersive experience.
And best of all, you don't get caught in the parking lot after the concert.
That's exactly right. Also, no alcohol.
Well, unless you brought it there.
Yeah, sure. So next page. So we also relied on our community for charity initiatives. So we picked 3 charities: Code, No Kid Hungry, and UNICEF. And we allowed our community to contribute with user-generated items. And then we matched the revenues that they made by selling those. And creators flocked to this. They were really eager to contribute. And finally, as a platform, we focused on parents struggling with balancing work from home with their kids being out of school. And we provided a selection of learning-centric experiences for kids to engage in, which was great because kids obviously already love Play or Roblox. And so it was easier for parents to get them interested in doing that as opposed to just doing, a math book or even, Skyping in with their classroom. And once again, this was possible by leveraging the huge amount of content available on the platform and aggregating it around an education-centric theme. So just to wrap this up, next page. So to me, what are the big takeaways? So all of these examples to me showcases how using systems versus internal content creation has allowed us to react to a wide variety of instances. So we were able to address a pretty diverse set of personal user needs quickly and without having to create any custom content. Imagine if we had to do that, we would never be able to do it because in such a short amount of time. And we just spun up new user cases, education or social hangouts or live music, and we leverage community-created experiences as the building blocks to deliver on those needs. And even when new content was needed, which that was the case with the charity items, we were also able to spin it up very, very fast by just stepping into our community at no additional cost for us. And this really, besides the benefits, the obvious benefits of these events, really created a tremendous goodwill with our community because we provided them with an outlet to contribute to a larger cause that they were really eager to help on. And the byproduct of that their attachment to the platform was strengthened as a consequence, and really that reinforced the virtual circle and on the systems that we basically build and continue building. So
Excellent. I'm struck by how much this really ties in with Bob's notion, which, again, he admitted he stole from Michael Deering, of Catholic versus Buddhist scaling. I feel like the Activision Blizzard model is the classic Catholic model, and the Roblox model is the Buddhist scaling model, where 1,000 flowers are blooming.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in fact, it's interesting because for us, we enter this, this new world, and I think that tax scaling was the big, the top item on our to-do list, because obviously we did not expect those volumes. We did that pretty quickly, and everything else was pretty much organic. Like, we didn't have to build anything. Everything was already there for users to engage. We just moved a few pieces around to highlight content or experiences, or ask for our community's help. But we didn't really need to, scale our teams, whatsoever.
Awesome. Laura, what kind of questions have we seen in the chat room?
So we've got people focusing on what are the best systems of scaling, but I want to ask a question. One of the things that Chris, Bob, and I talk about is descaling. When is there time? And right now you're highlighting, of course, there's so many users in a really quick amount of time. And you've got people that are online and they're creating their own communities, right?
Right.
And one of the the needs, of course, right now, especially in education, is to create engaging things. And at the same time, we all kind of struggle with screen time for our young people, right? My nephew spends 12 hours on a computer. He's prime for the COVID time. He knows how to do it really well. So as an organization, when have you chose to descale something? It sounds like you're very community driven. When have there been moments when you're you know what, I'm actually not going to scale that. We're going to pull back from that based on whether financial reasons or things that we decided for you to pull back and descale?
So, the interesting thing is scaling for us is a byproduct, right? So we don't control it. In a way, we don't really, we can't say, well, we scale this audience. So the audience scaled the audience. We provided systems for the audience to scale itself. So the same way we don't control it, and we can't really claim we did that. At the same time, it's hard for us to do the opposite, which is to descale it. I mean, descaling it, we could put some throttling in place, and we do that. Throttling meaning we would have situations where we don't want specific users to see specific content, right? Or things of that nature. So we definitely do that, but that's really not around descaling. It's more around trust and safety. We really leave the community to decide what's appropriate for them, both in terms of content, building content, how to monetize games, for example. We don't decide whether a game is too aggressive in monetizing or not aggressive enough. That's not our call. We stay as far away from content as possible. Our responsibility really as a platform is to make sure that if you come on the platform is safe, and you as a user have a good experience, so everything runs smoothly, and you as a developer has tools to make great stuff. So again, I know it seems counterintuitive, but again, if we serve the community, we focus solely on that. Everything else is a natural consequence of it. And engagement, scaling, monetization, they're all byproduct of it.
Great. So I have just a couple. We have lots of questions on Twitter. I have them in our back channel, if you will, of our things. And there's a question from one of our users, and I just put it in the screen here. Is you talk a lot about obviously the difference between franchise-driven models versus system-driven models.
Right.
And how do you think some of these models? We have a lot of watchers right now who are working in K-12 education. How do you think some of these models could be applied to the K-12 education context?
Well, so first of all, I'm not an education expert. I might, spitball here, just applying what I know. So, to me, the equivalent of the franchise model is to invest a ton in pre-made curricula, maybe a lot of resources available, a very structured sort of top-down approach to education. Whereas the systems driven model is more free form, where users or students in this case would figure out what's most important to them, what they're most interested in, and really create their own curriculum, and then maybe become not only students but also teachers of other students, right? This is essentially the model that we follow. These are developers that are essentially the little Activisions for kids of their age that actually enjoy doing what they do. And so I would assume that if you provide students with the tools and the technology to discover topics that they're interested in, and maybe create discovery tools for these topics, or maybe curriculum around these topics, then other students can actually use that. In fact, on Roblox, we actually have a ton of education games where some kids say, hey, I'm really interested in feudal Japan. And he built a showcase where he can walk through a feudal Japan town. And then he shared it with his friends. And then all of a sudden, and in some cases, they actually have historical notes on feudal Japan or specific items that were used at that time. And then kids running through that, would learn about feudal Japan. So I'm not arguing that they should use Roblox in school. What I'm saying is that when given the tools, students can create really interesting content that arguably is actually more interesting and more accessible, because this is somebody who's your peer that is teaching you, as opposed to some old guy that pretends to know what you're interested in.
I mean, you say you're not an educator, but I would say I echo all of the comments about creation.
Right.
The best learning is about creating something and creating and with your friends, right? The enjoyment. And one of the questions we didn't get to is like the engagement that we see, I think is inspirational. Kids are getting online and creating something that did not exist before.
Yeah.
And like giving them a platform to do that. And I think all of us who spend a lot of time in K-12 education think that is like really important. That is where authentic work happens. That's where like real purpose comes from.
Absolutely.
And so I think, although you say you're not, this is what we hope for education, is that more students are creating, right, something for themselves and for their friends that really is inspiring, that they're proud of at the end of the day.
And I think the social element is absolutely critical. Like the first spark of excitement for any developer of Roblox is when they can create something as rough as it is, and then share it with their friends, and seeing their friends coming into their creation. And we make that super easy. Like it's just pressing a button, and now the game is published. You can play. Your friend can sit on Xbox. I can play it on my phone. We're all together. And again, it's rough, but it's your thing, right? And that basically makes it feel real for you. And then you want to make it better. And your friends say, hey, why don't you do this? You're so good. And then you make it better, and then you publish it again. And then everybody's, making new suggestions, and the game grows. And it's really an awesome way to learn together. And, so I can absolutely see it as being a more like abstract model that you can apply to, general education. Again, not knowing much about education.
Well, and I'll kick it back to Chris, but I think in education, we talk about adoption versus adaption, and Chris can talk more about scaling. But I think, how do we really create a system where adaption is encouraged and creation in various forms is encouraged? And I think as we think about scaling, how do we continue to allow the thing that we're created to adapt and be co-created by a community? Right. When we're thinking about equitable creation, that is at the core. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and wisdom, and I'm going to kick it back to Chris.
Thank you again so much for coming on, Enrico. And I didn't even get to use the trivia thing that I learned about you today, which is that you started Italy's first hip-hop magazine.
That's true.
That will have to be something for another time.
I will show it to you next time we play.
Excellent. Well, but hold it up to the camera, because we aren't playing in person yet.
Yeah,
we're very good about social distancing.
I will do that.
Excellent. Well, Enrico, thank you so much. Please feel free to stick around and join in any of the other questions. And next up, let's go ahead and bring Othman Laraki on, our third and final guest. And I should say that it is especially impressive that Othman is here on the call today, because today is his son's third birthday. And he is actually taking time out from his son's third birthday party to be with us today. So, Othman, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, I think it's my son that was very generous, in letting me take a little bit of time. So, thanks for having me on.
So, Othman, one of the things that is really interesting is how you've pivoted color genomics. But before we get to the pivot, let's talk a little bit about what color genomics begins with. There's a personal history behind why you started the company. Can you talk about what motivated you to start the company and what it did before the pandemic?
Yeah, totally. So we're a health technology company that we started a little bit over 6 years ago. We kind of do distributed healthcare services, and we started in the genetics space, initially focused on the genetics of cancer, in part tied to like some personal family history around cancer. And I actually have one of those mutations in a gene called the BRCA2. So I had a lot of interest in this space and how genetics and healthcare connect to each other. And so we started that. When we started initially, it was really around facilitating and increasing access to high quality genetics, but in a very distributed way, just based on kind of some of my experiences and experiences of others. And it really was a kind of, in some ways, a kind of an interesting scaling story where you had a technology that used to be incredibly expensive, and that the cost was going down faster than Moore's law, actually, but the access to it was not going up in a proportional way, because everything around it, like all the kind of like usability and supply chain around getting access to high quality genetics, was still kind of moored in the kind of old cost and old access model. And so really that's where we started off. But over time, like, the company really evolved towards being a general kind of technology company that pushes kind of healthcare services to the edge, to make precision healthcare accessible to broad populations. So we work with over 100 large employers and health systems. We're doing a 1 million person project with the NIH. It's called All of Us. But really all of it is about kind of using technology to reach people kind of where they are, and take healthcare services to them.
Well, what happens? Like, let's say I go and I think I need to get a doctor to order a color genomics test for me, right?
Yeah, and by the way, we also call the company Color. We actually dropped the genomics from the name, in part because it's, we view genomics as just a technology, and really it is in a broader service, and so we just call it Color. But the way it works, it is we always involve a clinician. But either you have a clinician that you're working with, or if you don't, we also actually work with third-party networks to make that kind of clinical relationship, very like seamless and low friction, actually. So actually, we were kind of the company that really pioneered that model of providing clinical access to services like that, but with a very low friction experience. And actually, a lot of it was driven from my background, others on the team that had came from consumer software and consumer internet products, where you really learn the value of low friction experiences. That is one of the most important aspects of access, and we really wanted to bring that to clinical applications as well.
And then if I get a test result that says something like you had personally, I have a variant, a gene, something that predisposes me to something, what happens then? What do I do?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is like it's not just about the genetic results. It's actually, when you take a big step back, we, all of us, are at risk of a variety of things, and of varying levels. And today, the way we approach our healthcare by default is that the way the healthcare system, especially in the US, tends to work is that not much happens upstream from events, and you just kind of wait until someone has diagnosed with cancer or diabetes or something, and then kind of a bunch of interventions start cascading. But a lot of those happen after sometimes decades of missed opportunity to change a trajectory, only at the point where you are kind of at the point where a disease is kind of getting to an extreme state. And really what we do is we use a data-driven model to effectively make healthcare more Bayesian, if you will, where it's, right now it's you wait until there are like symptoms to start reacting to anything. Whereas in reality, for example, if you take, breast cancer, today, by default, unless a woman has, is known to have a mutation, all women are told, you should start getting mammographies at the age of 45. And so we pretend that all women have the same risk, whereas in reality, there is a distribution. And so for some, that is late. For others, it's actually very early. And so what we do is we help introduce a kind of predictive layer on top of that to help drive different prevention and interventions. And that applies in cardiovascular disease, cancer, obviously, diabetes, et cetera. There are a lot of the major diseases are not things that just happen overnight. They're oftentimes, when they're deemed diabetic, they've been on that trajectory for, a couple of decades sometimes. And, the further upstream you are, in some ways that your choices can have less amplitude, but more range. And I think that's kind of where there's a big opportunity with technology, because it allows us to generate this information on a marginally free way that, if you like by default, today, their standard model of healthcare, the mechanism of generating data and information about you is your interaction with someone, with another human being. And that's a very costly transaction. And so you end up really reserving it for low frequency events and really to detect end stage kind of diseases. Whereas through your genetics, through wearing an Apple Watch, your mobile phone, there's all of this data now that you can actually use in a very much more predictive model to start weaving that into how we think about caring for populations. And actually, what's happening right now with the COVID crisis is deeply relevant to it, because all of a sudden we swung into a mode where this year probably 80 or 90% of mammographies are not going to happen. There's going to be no colonoscopies. People are not going to go in for their annual checks. And so all of these things that we normally use to try to catch events are gone. And so, but we have now the ability to generate a lot of signal that tells you, who are the 10% who are at the highest risk of each one of the major diseases. If you're going to have only 10% of mammographies that are going to happen this year, you actually want to really target the right 10%. And so, so I think it's actually right now we're going through a really kind of interesting evolution of the entire healthcare space, because it's obviously a huge crisis, but I think it's going to cause an acceleration of a lot of things that would have otherwise taken maybe a couple of decades. So.
Now, the other thing that's interesting about this COVID crisis is that you and Color have actually ramped up and scaled up incredibly quickly testing effort. As we all know, testing has been hard to come by. People can't get the tests they want. People have had to wait hours for tests, but you've stepped into the gap. Talk about the decision-making process that went into saying, we can do something about this.
Yeah.
And what have you done to scale up so quickly?
Yeah, it was very interesting, because we by default are not an infectious disease company, and when we saw was, and we actually reacted very early internally, where we just see the data, and it was very obvious. There was nothing that I could see that would led me to believe that we would be any different than any of the countries that were having major outbreaks. So it was just math, right? It was just going to happen, and so we initially actually started doing a lot of COVID work just to protect our own employees and our population, because we run a large lab. One of the early things we did is we decided to, that's a subset of our company that has to be on site in order to do their job. And so we started off initially by just trying to protect them by taking everyone else remote to reduce their social exposure. And that kind of got us just thinking a lot more about the COVID crisis and really what was happening, and then it started striking us that it actually had a lot of similarities to the challenges we saw in the genomics and kind of related spaces, which is oftentimes in healthcare, I feel like people get really excited and fixated on thinking of healthcare as being a science and a medicine problem, whereas in reality, especially in the US, healthcare is much more of a logistics problem than a science and medicine problem. Today we're not applying 20-year-old science, and it's really about getting it to people and getting it scaled up and making it reach people where they are. And so that first of all is kind of something that was a bit striking. We started initially by because we have a lot of experience doing very kind of high level automation on the lab side. From our life in genetics, where we took a very different approach than a lot of traditional labs. Actually, maybe one point I'll make on that, because it's actually relevant to kind of the scaling conversation. The default way to approach a lab, that when you look at kind of the big kind of traditional lab companies, is that they all focus on running a very large number of tests, like lipid panels and genetics and this and that. And the side effect of that is that it makes it, you have to build a very general purpose system. But the more you generalize things, the harder they are to scale. And our intuition with genetics had been, and this was many years ago, was there will be a few kind of true mass scale applications that are the kind of the 80-20 rule of this kind of technology. And we want to build infrastructure to support kind of that 20% surface area that is the 80% of the applications. And so we built our lab in the genetics world with that principle. And as we were seeing kind of all these labs having struggling to scale. First of all, actually, we started by helping a lot of local labs with their automation. Like we just kind of lend them robotics code and just help them advising, et cetera. And it started striking us that actually it echoed a lot of what we had seen before. And we started developing a different approach to building a COVID testing lab that is really designed for scale, where instead of thinking like, what does a 1 to 5,000 a day testing lab look like? What does it look like to build labs that can do, hundreds of thousands of tests a day? And that felt much more like the kind of infrastructure that we knew how to build. So we started building that. And we're still very early, like we're still kind of like far from kind of like, being truly at that scale, but like that principle of like single purpose, highly automated design actually does have repercussions like through the entire kind of chain of as you design a system. And it's actually very similar to a lot of computer science, or like hardware design principles, et cetera. So like a lot of these things are very similar. The second thing actually that also echoed from our world on the genetics side is that having capacity is oftentimes not even the hardest problem. Oftentimes more difficult is making that capacity accessible to people. And the big killer in that, especially in the US, is because we have such a decentralized system, is that you have all these pieces that are not connected to each other in a streamlined way. And so you have this very non-integrated end-to-end experience. And we saw exactly that happen in genetics. And we're like, this is exactly what's going to happen, just much more so around COVID, which is how do you have a completely streamlined end-to-end where, you want to have, 1,000 people show up somewhere in a single day, multiple thousands, and you want to, get them tested. Like, what is the process and how do you make it a completely integrated experience? And so we repurposed all of the software we had from our genetics life back to this. And so we start now we're working with a lot of like frontline and essential workers. We have we're doing a lot of work with the city of San Francisco, actually, with the frontline essential personnel. So, fire, police, healthcare workers, et cetera. So that launched about 2.5 weeks ago. And then Mayor Breed kind of has been extending kind of the availability of that. Last week it got extended to, actually I can't remember if it was last week or this week. It's like the weeks are completely blending with each other now. But that got extended to all frontline workers. So even like, grocery workers, Uber drivers, essentially all people who have to be out there to do their job, like the essential people for society to work, now can use all these sites and services that are available in the city.
So this all happened very quickly because you mentioned you've had this up and running for 2 weeks now. How long did it take you to roll this out? Because when did you begin the effort? It can't have been that long ago.
Yeah, it started about 7 weeks ago. So if you count it in hours worked, it's maybe like 6 months.
So you compressed 6 months of work into 5 weeks in order to do this.
So I mean, we went from literally we did not have the lab space for it. Like our real estate company was very gracious in making a big space available to us, but we had to literally gut the space, rebuild all the inside. Design all the robotics, the automation, the protocol, the chemistry, and also because we did not kind of use the standard like default approach because we really wanted to make it designed for scale from the beginning, and so there was a lot of R&D that had to go in, and so but it was about like and really where it started off was about 7 weeks ago. Started off literally as an email to a handful of people in the company. It's like, hey, this is probably one of the biggest crises of our lifetimes. And what should we be doing about it? And should we just mobilize to try to make a contribution? So literally at the beginning, we had no idea what we should do or if we could help with anything. And so we spent maybe about a week, like just talking to a lot of people. And so a lot of people who were on the front lines, a lot of people who were kind of like all the labs, all the kind of local labs that we had very strong relationships with from the normal work we do. We just called them up and it's like, hey, how can we help? What can we do for you guys? Local people from the Department of Health, et cetera. Like talk to the FDA. Like just kind of basically we just called a bunch of people and said like, hey, we're this company that does a lot of stuff that's kind of relevant. We don't do infectious disease work by default, but let us know how we can help, and we're happy to mobilize. So that's really how it all started.
But this is incredible. I mean, this is very much like we saw earlier with Steph and U.S. Digital Response, where this was not a case where somebody put out the call for help. This is a case where people spontaneously said, this is the biggest threat that we've faced in our lifetime. We want to do something about it. And then you reached out to the city and local officials. And it sounds like that's gone very well. Tell us about what it's been like as a private company working with the government.
It's actually been amazing. I have to say, like, I have such deep respect for all the public servants that we work with. I mean, both like their competence and their dedication. I mean, it's actually an experience that like I never thought I would ever consider working in the public sector, but like it's been like amazing. I mean, the people that we've worked with both at the state and not just in California, like both level of dedication. I mean, I think one of the, I'm sure like after all this is hopefully out of our lives and done, I'm sure there are gonna be a lot of postmortems, like what could have been different, what could have done better. I think like there'll be a million things that we could have all collectively done better, not just the current government or the current people, but like societally, over the last like decades, right? Like, but I think one thing that's kind of a bit striking at times like this is that there are certain things that you assume are part of national infrastructure that actually make sense to have, as part of how we run society. Like I completely assumed that, if ever an outbreak happened, with all the outbreak movies that we've all seen, that, there's, the government has program 76 and, someone presses a button and all these people descend hazmat suits and they can, test 1 million people a day, no problem. And you realize in times like this, it's like, wow, that we actually, these things only get created when there is a crisis. It's kind of like the New Deal, like, the crisis kind of creates a catalyst for, these discontinuous investments to happen. And this felt like one of them. And I think it's been, like a lot of people just jumping in and trying to help, and all the way from like, literally we run some sites in San Francisco where there are volunteers who show up to help, just like at the individual level, all the way to people. A lot of engineers kind of reached out to, just jump in and help, build stuff with us. So it's been just an amazing kind of, rallying effort, and people just taking leadership, like, at the end of the day, right? Like, it's just people like us, like everyone that makes this stuff. And this, I think you see that happening here. And I mean, I think we're in it for the long. I mean, this is not, I think for the first few weeks, we're all running on adrenaline. But I think, was having this conversation with people on the team, it's like, no, this is going to be a marathon. This is going to be a while. And I think that's where, like, people's dedication, commitment really, really kicks in. Is like, I think it's going to take a while for all this to, get fixed. So.
Now, this is an amazing story. We're going to open it up to questions shortly. I'm going to get one of my own questions in just because it's my prerogative to sneak one in. You built a lab from scratch in 5 weeks, including R&D on the setup, gutting a building and everything like that. That's not something you would have ever done before this crisis. What did you do differently, and what have you learned from that process that you can apply to go even faster in the future, even when this crisis passes?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, we're lucky to have a truly spectacular team, like both on the kind of lab side and robotics, as well as the engineering. And I think one thing that's been very unique is that we have that very kind of like deeply integrated stack. So in some ways, we did not go from a pure cold start because we had actually a lot of the building blocks that enabled us to, repurpose a lot of the systems that we had. So that was a big thing. The other thing that was kind of interesting is like when we built our initial lab for genetics, like at the time we had, common wisdom usually to put up a high quality, high scale lab. It's normally like a year-long process. And when we had initially done it, we deliberately tried to do it in 3 months. And we pretty much hit that target, actually. And at the time, everyone was thought we were crazy when we were trying to do it that fast. And, and obviously it took time to really, fully stabilize everything, et cetera. But it was interesting to see how with new technology, new tools, et cetera, you can actually accelerate a lot of things that people just assume are fixed. And then I think that kind of taught us that a lot of these timelines can be fungible. And so like but the other thing that was very different in this scenario is that, I mean, everyone was like so mobilized to help us. For example, I mean, like, city permitting, right? Like, people were showing up like over weekends, 24/7 work. And so like, all these things that normally are serialized just happened like very, very quickly. And that was, I think, partially the crisis response.
Awesome. Laura, I believe we have questions from the Twitter sphere.
We do, and it's been a fun thing to grab them and like codify them. We've got a bunch, and so I'm just going to start with one that I know was of interest to some of our other panelists. Is Elizabeth is asking, Color's work for COVID is really outside of your original mission. So how will you know when to descale this work and refocus back on your original mission?
Yeah, it's a good question about like, it's been interesting actually, because I don't think it is. Like, I think, what is, in some ways it begs the question, is like, what is our mission? And really our mission is to use technology to help people be healthier. And I think that's really our mission. Like, because I think it's been an interesting journey for us as a company, because, sometimes your tools become your identity. And like, because we started off really deep in genetics, and in cancer, like we've had these kind of evolutions in our kind of life where these things that really are just parts of what you're trying to do, but within a broader context. And so, for example, genetics, like from my perspective, genetics is not a product. It's literally just a technology that allows you to understand people's health better. And so really the goal is to understand health so you can do something about it. And so like, I think it's interesting. I mean, even for me as, one of the co-founders, it's been interesting to kind of, I think over time, like you realize really why you're in it and, what you're actually trying to achieve. And sometimes like these things that, are, just part of why, your initial tool set, you realize at some point that's really what they are. And they're a building block that, but your mission is actually more the human impact that you're trying to achieve.
Great. And so a lot of the question, I mean, this is a question for a lot of our viewers right now, is like, not only like figuring out what initially their product innovation is, but really is what's at core for them that they don't want to let go of. Bob likes to say, what's sacred for them? Like, what is the most sacred thing that they're thinking about? And one of the questions I'll just show up again, and there's another question as well that I want to ask, but one of our audience members, and this is so right up your alley with what the work that you're trying to do, is that there's definitely been a renewed interest, right, in the importance of public health and healthcare, and all the work that you're doing with the city. And there's like an investment as a community basis. So, sorry, it should be how might folks really mobilize and organize now to ensure that this renewed and ongoing investment doesn't end? And so how are you all thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because like I think right now we're in this window, and it's obviously we'd rather not be in it, but it's also, I think there's an opportunity when things like this happen, because at the end of the day, right, like our like human health is literally one of the biggest assets we have as a society. It's like the humans that are in the society are like our biggest asset, right? Like collectively, and their health is basically at the core of that, right? Like that's why global warming is so important. Like I think there's like these kind of assets that we are sometimes easy to underinvest in before there's a crisis, and then you realize their true value. I think what's going to happen out of this actually is less the mobilization side. I hope we demobilize. I mean, I can't, none of us can sustain working this way, right? And so I hope we get out of the crisis mode for sure. But I think what this is going to do is that I think it actually breaks a lot of the kind of stratification and a lot of the parts of the system that we would have needed to, that we really had needed to rebuild and break in order to kind of move forward. And so I think there is a kind of a creative destruction or a valuable kind of that's happening out of forcing, for example, a lot of healthcare to go virtual, or like all of us, like just in our daily work life, right? Like it turns out that maybe we don't need to drive so many miles, et cetera. Like, and so I think some of this breakage, I think hopefully has some, positive side effect. I think that's the most durable thing. Like that's going to be the thing that, has for which the integrals going to be much more important than the spike of effort, because the spike of effort is not sustainable.
And I want to ask this last question because it came up, and I think it connects back to the work. I mean, it connects directly to the work that, as you said, your mission is greater than just your product, right? It's a mission to serve everyone and to ensure that like everyone has access to healthcare, and you're doing that daily. And so, and as you just said, this is revealed, and we really a broken system. And so, as you think about this question that one of our last Twitter followers are asking is like, when you think about do mass scaling solutions exacerbate the forces of inequality? How do we make sure it's inclusive, unbiased, and fair? And I know you're actively thinking about that, particularly as it relates to healthcare, because it is the most important thing that people can get access to.
Yeah, it's actually a great question, and it's one where, because I think oftentimes common wisdom is that technology reduces access, and it's like it goes to the rich first, etc. But actually, I think that's wrong. I think that's literally wrong. Like, because the thing that like reduces access is like availability. And convenience of access. And I think technology makes healthcare much more accessible. Like, for example, when you think about oftentimes all the debates around healthcare access, what everyone focuses on is the cost of care. We all think that healthcare is not affordable for most people, which is true. There's a big cost problem. But actually what is even more costly is the ability to access it in the first place. Like if you're, a single mother, working like, 2 jobs, hourly wage, etc., the time for you to go and get care is actually much more prohibitive than the cost of it. And what technology does is that it allows you to access that care on your terms, on your time, et cetera, in a way like, when you think about, how long it takes you the amount of time it takes for a primary care visit, you need to call to schedule it. You need to be able to plan ahead of time. You need to drive over there. You need to wait, et cetera. It's like, it's a 6-hour block probably for HPCP visit. Whereas like, if you are able to virtualize some of that, that is eminently more accessible, like, so that people can do it at home, et cetera. Like, and so I think actually technology is essential to that solution. And that's completely borne out with our work. Like, for example, we work with these very large unionized workforces, like, the Teamsters truck driver union. And so it's like, all the, truck drivers in the Northeast, where, normally like, not as well-served population, et cetera. And, we've had, a huge number of them using us and actually helping a lot of people that hadn't had any primary care visits in multiple years, et cetera. And so I think like, that's where like, being able, like technology is very important in reducing that friction to access. And so, and fundamental to scaling a lot of the kind of like technologies and science that's kind of, coming into the market.
I told the crew I have one more question. Because it would behoove of me to say that we have a lot of educators, that are watching us right now. And I know it would be a value of thinking about, maybe you're not thinking about this, that you are, but like you're providing access to these toolkits and these testings. And we've got people that are thinking about going back to school, right? And you're working directly with the city, you're working with San Francisco. And what are your thoughts right now about how we provide more access, particularly in like K-12 education, or even here locally in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, about how do we get, equip our schools to go back safely, given, the conditions that we're in is a need that I know is not just here in the Bay Area, but far and wide as people think about access to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question is because, we're trying to reopen the economy now and reopen the country. And, it's important to realize that in a sad way, like almost nothing has changed since the outbreak started from the perspective of like, our biology is the same. Most people have still not been infected. So if we just go back into the same thing, we're just going to go right back into the original ramp. Like there's like nothing fundamental has changed. The two things that we actually can change now is, one is operationalizing social distancing, where we can effectively like reduce, like take out all of the kind of like, aspects of connectivity that are unnecessary for us to be able to come back in. So that's one piece. The other one is, because so much of the transmission is from asymptomatic people, you need to be able to catch outbreaks early, right? And so, any of the large pools of people, whether it's like, probably education is a big one. Obviously, the workplace is a huge kind of like context of transmission. And that's where like a very active testing strategies, I think, is going to be very important, so that we're able to, very rapidly detect, kind of catch, cases early before their outbreaks, and then trigger all the kind of isolation and contact tracing, et cetera. So I think that's going to be like that has to be part of the solution until we have a vaccine.
Thank you. I know that's a question that I know my educators are thinking about, is like, how can we get this more quickly into schools, right? As quick as possible, to get back to the new normal, whatever that is right now. I know I'm bringing back our other esteemed friends. I just want to thank you for the work that y'all are doing. It's really inspiring that you saw this need as designers. One of the things we like to think about is we see a need or an invisible need, and we like design for it, and we design to solve it. And so this is just a nice example of why design, and how we really, and designers really look for the needs that are not yet met. And I think you all really embody that piece of design. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me. And by the way, and one last important thing, I think it's like the key thing here has been kind of the mobilization of all these people, where it's like, it's actually, so Bob's daughter, Eve Sutton, actually works at Colors, one of the amazing people who has made all of this happen. And it's literally like, all these people who just kind of jump in and focus on, helping other people and, delivering great experience. So, but thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Othman. It was a true pleasure to have you here. I think it's really amazing when we look back on the past couple of hours and think about the stories that we've heard. We've heard about thousands of volunteers getting together, self-organizing, and creating an organization that is helping governments all around the country deal with the crisis. We heard about an industry which has essentially doubled overnight in terms of its volume, but not just from a business model perspective and making money perspective, from the perspective of, can we turn this medium of video games from something that is used to entertain children into something that is used to raise money, to bring people together in a time of social distancing, and to provide education to all those kids who are now at home. And then finally, we heard from Othman about how they were able to build a completely new lab in 5 weeks, thanks to the efforts of not just the folks at Color, but also the city, the inspectors, all these different people working around the clock, because we're all fighting this common enemy. I can't help but come away from these stories and think about what incredible scaling people are capable of when motivated by something like this. In my book, Blitzscaling, which I wrote with my friend Reid Hoffman, we talk about incredible growth. We talk about companies that triple in size every year. Here we're talking about things where things are tripling every week. And it's so impressive and so amazing. What are some final thoughts that you take away from this, Laura or Bob?
Okay, well, so I have one comment. So one of the things that strikes me about all three guests, and you just saw it at the end with Othman, is in particular in all of them, is there's this research that essentially shows that when a really existential or any sort of severe threat hits people or organization, to oversimplify, some will view it as a threat where people freak out, they freeze up, they just can't move forward. And the other, although they'll acknowledge the stress, will view it as an opportunity for us to do something different with what we have. And in all three cases, you can see how the leadership really did that. And just knowing some of the inside gossip about Color really has done that, and we see that with Steph, and we see that with Roblox too. I just don't know those cases as well, but to me, that's one of the things that I hope we can take away from this crisis, is to teach our future and current leaders how they can make that happen, because these are all examples of that happening. So that's one thing that struck me. Laura, what about you?
I was struck so much about, oftentimes when people think about innovation, they think about the thing, they think about the product or the idea that's like the compelling piece. And I think what was great about all the different stories, and I know for our viewers online that are thinking about how to scale up their thing, everything that we talked about today was about community, it was about engaging people, and it was activating people around a common mission. And as Enrico said, that's the byproduct. It's not the thing. It's the community is the thing. And I think sometimes that we think about, there should be maybe a new word for scaling. It's really about community and bringing people together. Steph, her mission, and of course, Othram was like, it's not even about this massive thing they're doing. And it's about bringing people together on a common mission and activating them and allowing them to take hold of this idea and come together. And I think when I think about scaling, how do we scale that? How do we encourage more people to be inclusive, to be more equitable in the communities that they're creating? And that in and of itself is a scaling problem, but I also think it's an education problem. And I'm curious about how we can continue to do that across all the sectors. And maybe this global crisis, I think, is revealing that our communities are more powerful than we thought, and that they have more voice than they thought. And how do we give light to those voices? So that's kind of where I'm struck by.
And I think it's amazing when we think about these responses that we've seen today. These are all community responses.
Yep.
As Othman described it, he thought, well, doesn't somebody just invoke Order 78 and then the hazmat suits come in helicopters? It turns out, we're the cavalry, right?
Right.
The community is the cavalry that is coming to save the day. And we see that in the story of U.S. digital response and in Roblox and in terms of color. So that's pretty impressive. When I look back on all of this, what I'm reminded of another moment in history, a very different moment in history, but one which I think we look back on fondly. If we think about the great space race of the 1960s, when we think about the great technological accomplishments, doing something that was thought impossible, the Apollo missions really encapsulate that. You have John F. Kennedy at the beginning of the decade saying something that people thought was absurd. We're going to land a man on the moon and bring him or her back. That's astonishing. And yet it was something that was accomplished. And what I really like about that is, if you remember when Apollo 11 landed on the moon and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out of the surface, they left a plaque there on the moon. And the plaque says, "We came in peace for all mankind." Not, "We claim this land in the name of the United States of America," but "we came in peace for all mankind." And what's interesting about the pandemic, it has the potential to divide. It has the potential to stir up all these negative things, but it also has the potential to unite, to get these various communities of technologists in Silicon Valley, video game enthusiasts, city officials here in the Bay Area, to all work together, to come together to rapidly scale up solutions and ways to fight the pandemic.
So Chris, I like that. And if you link that to what we've heard, to me, this is why for leaders, framing is so important, because you can frame something as united or division. You can frame something as a threat or an opportunity, and a common enemy or not. And it really makes a difference at every level of leadership.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this has been a fantastic evening. This, amazingly enough for us instructors, is only the beginning, because we have an entire class to teach tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah.
But before we go, we would be remiss if we did not highlight the incredible efforts of our fourth instructor, Mark Chun.
Yes.
You guys don't know this because you've been watching this stream. Everything's looked smooth. Backstage, weird technological problems have been going off. Mark's been tearing his hair out. Things were causing, all this incredible suspense. It was literally like one of these Mission Impossible movies where you're defusing a bomb. And Mark made everything. I mean, you guys didn't see anything, but backstage, Mark was MacGyvering things together. And I just want to thank Mark for the incredible efforts to make this all work out.
Yeah. And I just want to thank everyone who showed up and listened, and of course our guest speakers, and for Chris and to Bob for facilitating, and to all the folks that are who are on Twitter, just jumping in and sharing their voices. We are going to be sharing this out. We recorded this, and we'll definitely be sharing this video more broadly so that people can learn from these great stories of people that are making a difference. So we're excited to share that from the D.school.
And remember, we are the cavalry. So
we
you
are
have
the cavalry.
All been officially deputized. We expect everyone on this stream to join in the fight.
We are the cavalry. I think that's the summary.
Thank you so much. And we hope that everyone has a great night and a great weekend, and that these lessons stick with you for many weeks and hopefully months to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.